This is Ayani.
And this is Corinne.
And welcome to another La Petite SLL, a sex, love, literature minisode.
This episode, we wrap up our podcast keyword miniseries and ask the question, why literature?
We talk about the differences between capital L and little l literature, the so-called canon, along with how and why we choose which books, TV shows, films, and other media we discuss on the pod.
If you'd like to join the conversation and share your thoughts on literature, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at SexLoveLit.
And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platforms.
All right, let's get started.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Sex, Love, Literature. I hope you all are doing very, very well. Thank you for tuning in to listen to us. So this episode is going to be the wrap-up for our three-part mini series, I guess.
Mini?
I don't know. I feel like 3 episodes is very small. But
I mean, so yes, but also I was thinking our definition of La Petite SLL is 20 to 30 minutes is a lie. It basically just means it might not be an hour and a half, but like it might still be an hour.
She's so yeah, I don't know what I was thinking when we first started recording these episodes. I was like, yes, 20 to 30 minutes. We're going to keep it tight. We're going to keep it small. They're going to be bite-sized conversations. And then here we go, finishing episodes that are like 50 fucking minutes long. It's like, okay. So much for and we invested so much effort into figuring out what the name for these episodes were going to be. And we're like, La Petite, yes, they're small, they're bite-sized. They're not. It's a lie. But anyhow, this is the third of our explorations of the keywords of our title. So first we did why sex, the next one we did was why love, and then this, of course, would be why literature. This one, I think we're both really excited to talk about because literature broadly is something that I think has been formative and very important to both of us.
I think this is also a subject that we both have established rants that we like to get on our soapboxes about. So
Yeah. And I will say that we have been asked more than once, why is it sex, love, literature if y'all don't talk about any books? So we're going to unpack some of that today, thinking about what literature means to us, what it means for us as quote unquote literature scholars to be doing this kind of podcast and taking it from there. But first, let's do a What's Sparking Joy. So to refresh, What's Sparking Joy is a little segment that we do in which we do a rapid fire conversation about the different kinds of media, be that film, television, video games, music, etc., that is bringing a little light to our lives. But we're not necessarily going to spend an hour and a half talking about them on this particular episode. Yet. ... So, Corinne, what is sparking joy for you?
So what is sparking joy for me is, surprise, surprise, a K-drama. The one of I think 4 I'm currently watching actually is called Hometown Cha-Cha-Cha. I deeply love it. It's set in a small town in South Korea instead of Seoul because most dramas tend to be set in Seoul. So I love the small town hijinks. But we're probably going to end up doing a deep dive on that show. So instead of talking about the show right now, I am instead going to talk about the actor who plays the male lead. His name is Kim So-no, and I deeply love him.
She finally has a bias, ladies and gentlemen. She sent me a message on Instagram. She was like, I think I found him. I have found my bias. I was like, congratulations.
I mean, it took me a very long time. So, I mean, I don't know, because there's been a lot of like actors, Korean actors, that I've been very into, and I'm still into most of them. But like Kim So-no, man, I don't know, something about him is like,
it's those dimples, girl. That's what you said.
Yeah, I think it's the dimples. I don't know, and he's like very tall, and he's super cute, and also like it helps that the character he's playing on this show is like very handy and very helpful, and like shows up when you need him. And since right now I like just finished moving and just like need I spent 30 minutes last night putting together my desk chair and could not for the life of me get the chair onto the base. And was like,
No, bud.
I just need this man to show up and help me put together my desk chair.
Oh no, bud. I'm sorry.
But anyway, so what's sparking joy? It's Kim So-no. I love him. I will be going back and watching everything in his back catalog, including another one that I'm watching right now is Startup, which I spent a year not watching because it looked stressful and I didn't want to. But he's in it, and he's the second male lead, so now I'm almost done with it. And I spent a year not watching that drama on purpose.
You just needed the right catalyst, let's say, the right impetus to get you watching it.
So that is the main thing that's sparking joy. But something else that is also sparking joy that I'm going to do a little plug for. I'm going to be a guest panelist on the podcast Afternoon of Delight, which is one of our podcast friends.
Yeah, we call them our podcast unis, right?
Yeah, so it's a podcast with 3 American romance authors who look at K-dramas from a writer's lens, and the subject of the episode that I will be guesting on will be favorite K-drama kisses. But so I'm also enjoying going back through like my back catalog of dramas that I've seen to figure out which kisses are the most interesting to me.
So I'm just going to cast my vote right now for It's Okay to Not Be Okay, because we spent quite some time talking about that in our episode on It's Okay to Not Be Okay. Those were spicy kisses.
We did.
Spicy.
So something
there was even a deer.
So a couple of things that I've been thinking about as I'm sort of like trying to narrow that down are like, because there are some kisses that have been like hot and otherwise like very medium dramas. So I'm thinking, for example, of The Bride of the Water God, which was like very, very fine. But the kiss in that drama was like a lot. It was very good. There are some actors and actresses that just like know how to kiss on screen, I think. But I think when I'm picking my favorites, I'll probably also take into account sort of narrative impact, because I think that also matters to me and not
just the spiciness.
Yeah, I'm not some people may come for me when I say this and say that I'm lying, but I am not just here to watch people make out.
Well, I'm not. I mean, usually when we talk about people making out, it's usually, for the deeper context. I mean, sometimes we're just like, man, that kiss was hot. But usually we have things to say about why people are kissing. So, like, I support you. I support you.
2 things that are sparking joy for me: Hometown Cha Cha Cha, Kim So-no, and I guess this is 3, and the Afternoon of Delight podcast.
Which you also go check out.
Yes, it's very fun.
We'll throw a link in our bio.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Ayani, what's sparking joy for you?
All right, I'm going to go rapid fire because I always end up talking way too long whenever we do this. But the first for me is Yumi's Cells, which is a K-drama that is just debuting on Viki. Part of the reason that it sparks so much joy for me is this is a webtoon that I was reading and absolutely adored. One of my students actually put me on to Yumi's Cells, and I am forever grateful to that student because I really, really, really love it. And I'm really enjoying watching the adaptation choices that they're making in moving from a comic to a live action. And I have feelings about adaptations of comics and feelings about adaptations of animation, but that is a conversation for another day. But Yumi's Cells, definitely sparking joy. I've also been watching The Devil Judge, which is a stressful show, but I'm very into it. I'm constantly texting Corinne because this is one she fell off of. And I'm like, please go back and watch it because I need someone to talk to about this show. But part of what is sparking joy for me with Devil Judge is the main actor, Ji-sung. And he's apparently a K-drama actor with a very, very long history. And I totally get it. I'm so convinced by him in this role as a devil judge. But also, this man has insane cheekbones. And I can't stop looking at his face. And when his hair is down, when his forehead is exposed, I'm just like, how? I don't understand how gorgeous he is, but also
so it's the dimples and cheekbones for us, I guess.
yeah, that's the theme of the episode is dimples and cheekbones. But it also, his cheekbones remind me a lot of like Manny Jacinto's cheekbones, and I think this is now a thing that I'm going to be paying attention to. Is the drama in the cheeks, I suppose. But The Devil Judge is great. I highly recommend it. I'm not all the way through, but I have a lot of feelings and would love to talk to somebody about that. And finally, I am slowly making my way through, though I watched a lot yesterday because I was tired, but I'm slowly making my way through season 3 of Sex Education. And honestly, I think this is my favorite season so far of
Oh,
all of them.
interesting.
But one of the things that I'm really loving about it, and this is again another conversation for another day, is that the Black characters are not isolated in their Blackness. And I think they started making changes to that in the second season. But all of the Black characters that are kind of like the main focal point Black characters have in this season other Black people that are circling around them. And that's something that I kind of always catch or pay attention to in films when there are Black main characters. Is it's like, okay, are you the only Black person for miles and miles and miles? Do we not see your family? Do you have no other Black friends? It's just something that like I pay attention to. So it's really nice to kind of see interaction between Black folks. And as a minor spoiler that I don't think anyone will get mad at me if they haven't watched season 3 yet, but Eric and his family go back to Nigeria for a wedding. So yeah.
Ooh.
So it's a lot of fun to see like Eric's extended family in Lagos in a Nigerian setting. So that's a lot of fun. And also I've been like Shazamming all of the songs that I don't recognize. So I might be listening to Afrobeats for the rest of the day.
Sounds great to me.
Yeah, that might be it's cheekbones, dimples, and Afrobeats. But that's what's sparking joy for me. Rapid fire. A lot of TV, because that's just kind of where my head is right now. But yeah, so joy has been sparked. Also, I'm apparently really corny today. I don't know. Maybe I should just embrace it. Like, what's the meme where it's like, I don't care that I'm cringe. I'm cringe, so I am free. I don't know. But anyhow,
I'll take your word for it.
I appreciate you. This is why we're friends. So, getting to the main topic at hand. Why literature? Y'all can't see me making hand gestures. I don't know why I'm making hand gestures, but I did for why literature. So, Corinne, if I'm going to throw this question at you, but when we put literature in the title, kind of what were we thinking? Does having literature as part of the podcast title maybe cause some people to look at our show a particular way? Like, what are your thoughts about kind of having literature as part of how we sell ourselves?
So I think the first two reasons that jump to mind about why we put literature in the title. First is the alliteration with love. Second,
absolutely yes.
And second, I think, is because we are English literature scholars.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting PhDs in English literature.
Mm-hmm.
So it's part of, I think, our scholarly identities.
Yeah, definitely.
And we didn't want this just to be a review podcast because review podcasts are great. I like them a lot. I listen to many of them. But we wanted something a little bit meatier, I think, and a little bit more analytic. So I think that's why, I don't know, we did like sex love literature as opposed to like sex love TV shows or like I mean, not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think another piece of it as well that we will now get into is the definition that we have for literature is a very expansive one. So I think it didn't necessarily even occur to me to hesitate at calling our podcast Sex Love Literature because to me, literature already encompasses books, comics, TV shows, films, any kind of media that has some sort of narrative to it that I can sort of sink my teeth into.
Yeah. So this leads to kind of a larger conversation that I know I've had or been a part of multiple times over the course of my graduate education. But the idea of capital L literature versus lowercase literature, right? And I think Corinne and I don't necessarily abide by that kind of distinction, right? That
Mm-mm.
capital L literature is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, because this is kind of my understanding, but when I hear capital L literature, I hear like, oh, that's Shakespeare, that's Marlowe, that's Toni
Mm-hmm.
Morrison. These are these pieces of classic text based printable literature that kind of make up the quote unquote canon, which we have kind of railed on before in a previous episode.
Mm-hmm. Well, and like by canon, we mean texts that, as a whole, and this is something that people argue with, that like texts that are quote unquote worthy of study.
Yeah.
So like
Mhm.
that is your like established authors, but I think even then, the authors that we think of, so the canon I think is a lot more malleable than we often are led to believe it is. So like for example, even an author like Jane Austen, who is decidedly in the canon, only got into the canon like within the last 50 years,
Mhm. Mhm.
because
I
you
mean,
know she was a woman's author.
yeah, I mean, me mentioning Toni Morrison as part of capital
Yeah,
L literature is kind of, I don't wanna say a political stance, but, like, Toni Morrison, I would say, was only added to the canon within the last, like, 20 years. Is that fair
yeah.
to say? Because I know I
um
studied Toni Morrison in high school, which
I think that Toni Morrison maybe, I mean, and this is one of the reasons that the canon is problematic, because obviously Toni Morrison is brilliant and writes excellent books.
right,
But also like there is this tendency, because the canon is exclusionary, to be like, oh well,
yes,
like now we have a black author in the canon, we don't need any more, we have
right,
Toni Morrison. And
right,
that's
mhm.
obviously untrue.
Bunk, yeah, and that's, again, a longer conversation, but I guess kind of thinking about capital L literature, that's kind of in my brain the connection that's made, like
Hmm.
the literature worth study,
Well,
right?
and traditionally the canon is very white, very male, very Western,
Mhm, mhm, mhm,
and anything outside of that is an exception. And there is, I think, a move within literature studies that we are a part of, not just to expand the canon, but to get rid of the notion of the canon
mhm,
altogether,
mhm, mhm.
because it does more harm than good.
Yeah, I think expand, examine, or exterminate, perhaps.
Are we Daleks from Doctor Who now?
Exterminate. Oh god. I was running with the ease since you said alliteration, but I mean, I think there are all different kinds of ways of thinking about how to handle kind of a quote unquote canon, right? And we all have different feelings about that. But kind of on the flip side of that, you have lowercase l literature, which I still think Corinne and I have a very broad understanding of, because a lot of times people will say literature and they mean books. But when we say literature, we mean, as you were saying, almost anything with a narrative that you can really get into.
Hmm.
So, one of an exercise that I did with some of my undergrads was I had them like get up and stand on either side of the room and make decisions on what kinds of texts were literature. And I think this was a lot of fun because honestly, I don't have an answer for all of them, right?
Hmm.
So, for example, I showed like a picture of Naruto, the manga, on the screen, and they were like, most of them were like, yeah, that's literature. And then they went to the other side. But then I showed like a clip from a wrestling promotion, and I was like, okay, is this literature? And that was a bit more divided. And then I put up
Hmm.
lyrics to, oh, I think it was Bohemian Rhapsody. So I put up lyrics to that and I was like, okay, is Bohemian Rhapsody literature? And what happens if we're just reading the lyrics versus listening to the song? Does that change your understanding of what literature is? And if
Hmm.
we move from Queen to say Lil Nas X, do you then have a line for literature between that? Which I think if you do, you have some deep thinking that you need to engage in.
Well, and I think what's happening here is there are two different sort of divides when we think about the word literature. There's both the
Uh-huh.
sort of highbrow established canonness of the
Mhm.
author or
Mhm.
creator or songwriter or
Right.
whatever.
Mhm.
And then there is a question of medium,
Right.
because
Mhm.
and I'm a little less salty at colleagues who don't think about like film as literature, if by literature they're like, oh, well, like it needs to be a book.
Mhm.
um I still don't agree with them, but I'm not mad at them the way I am if someone's like, I will only read Henry James. Like, okay, whatever.
Okay.
So like there's one way to approach it that makes me angry, and one way to approach it that makes me like, okay, well, I don't agree with you, but that's fine.
And I think that in part also stems from the disciplines within English
Mhm.
literature that Corinne and I are a part of, because as you all well know, I'm a comics and animation person. Corinne is a children's literature person. And both of our disciplines are, I don't want to say relatively new, because I feel like newness in the concept of the academy is very different from like newness in a broader sense, if that makes sense. But comics have not been taken seriously, say, as long as Shakespeare has been taken seriously within the
Mhm.
academy. And
And then the same for children's literature. I think
yeah,
comics might be even newer
I think
than
so.
children's literature.
I think so, because comics, so film had to kind of make its way into the academy first and have that fight of being considered as something worth of critical study, which it sounds weird to think about. Like, of course, films are worth critical study, right? But it's the same kind of thing with comics, is comics had to kind of make that fight to say, we're not just, you know, ephemeral pieces that you can ignore, but also I think there's a large conversation about ephemeral pieces also mattering, but that's neither here nor there. But that comics are something worthy of study and attention, yada, yada, yada.
Mhm.
So I think in a lot of ways, and feel free to disagree with me here, but it feels like a lot of us, while we take our area of scholarship not for granted, but kind of like, of course, it's worth studying, there are people who still need to be convinced that that
Well,
is the case.
yeah, and I think one way that that's pretty evident is like if we look at various English departments across, I don't know, I guess I don't know about other national contexts, but like
Mhm,
across the
mhm,
United States, most programs have like a Victorianist and a
mhm,
Shakespearean and an early Americanist, and like these sort of and this is moving a little bit away from like hiring people based on the period they study to like different
mhm,
things like
mhm,
an African American literature specialist
mhm.
and things like that. But
Post-colonial studies and things like that, yeah.
so that is at least broadening a little bit. But like beyond that, most places don't have a children's literature specialist or a comic specialist.
Mhm,
Like
mhm.
that's still outside the norm.
Yeah, yeah, and
And
it's
part of that, it's part of it is because like it's not just that they're like, oh, like that would be neat and extra, but we just won't have it. It's like, oh, there is nothing worthy of study in children's literature and comics at all. Why would we have someone here who does that?
right, and it's changing, it's changing. It's not that there are not people who do this kind of work, obviously, because we are not the first, right,
Oh
to
yeah,
make these kinds of
not at
decisions.
all.
There are a lot of established scholars doing a lot of fantastic and interesting work, but there are also still people who will kind of look down on that kind of research. And I think that's also part of the reason that we have this kind of broad thought process. And when I say we, I mean Corinne and I have this broad thought process about what literature is and what it means. You
Hmm.
know, like, yeah, I think in a lot of ways, we do not put lines around literature because we think a lot of it, if not all of it, is worthy of somebody looking at. And we only really talk about it and bring it up to be grumpy about it, not to like draw extra lines. You know what I mean?
Well, and I do think this is something I think about in my like in my academic work. I think on the podcast.
Hmm.
I mean, actually, this is maybe an interesting question. Like in my academic work, even within children's literature, there is still, I think, a question for me is what is worth the time of writing about? And sometimes
Mm-hmm.
that's because,
Hmm.
like, I think a book is particularly good, even if it wasn't very widely read, or if I think it deals with, like, a subject, like, say, sexual assaults in an
Right.
interesting
Hmm.
way. But sometimes it's like, oh, this book is very, very popular and being super widely read. We
Yeah.
should think about why or what ideologies it's passing on. But then for the podcast, I mean, there is the sort of the metric of like, will people listen to us talk about it? So we have to maybe think about popularity a little bit more.
Yeah.
And not that it's the only thing that we think about, but like Because I think partially because there are so few children's literature scholars, but so much children's literature that's
Mm,
continually being churned out. There isn't
yeah.
time to talk about everything. So there does need to be some sort of selection. And it's not that
Mm,
I only write about things that I think other people will care about, because sometimes my job is to be like, I care about this. I think it's important.
yeah.
I'm
Mhm.
going to
Mhm.
convince you that you should care about it too.
Right.
But there I think is still some sort of selection criteria that goes on. It's just not, is this capital L literature? It's
Right.
different criteria that we take into account.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, part of I think what helps the selection, I'm putting quotes around this, selection criteria is time, because academic publishing is very, very slow if you're
Mhm.
going the kind of traditional journal publishing academic text route and not necessarily like the public humanities route. It takes a long time for people to get their work out there in the way
Mhm.
that the podcast doesn't. I mean, I know we're slow sometimes, but I'm a grad student and it takes me a long time to edit things I'm learning. But like, it's not the same amount of time as like when I write a piece for an edited collection and when it actually gets published and put out there,
Oh, yeah, like for scale, my first article, from when I first submitted it to when it was published, was about 2 years.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. So it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time, and you wanna make sure that you're investing in something, A, that you care about, right? B, that you have something really to say about that thing, but C, also, when 2 years goes by, like, do you still wanna stand by the work that you've done? I mean,
Mhm.
like, with the podcast, I'm sure 2 years from now, we might look back on some things and be like, my opinion on that has changed." You know what I mean? But I don't know, for me, it feels a little bit different in how I feel about throwing things at the wall to see how they stick with kind of what we do here.
Well, and I do also think there is a little bit more freedom in doing that. Like,
Mhm, mhm.
I don't know, like, we are just, like, giving our opinions sometimes, or, like, saying that someone's dimples and cheekbones are really great, and I don't gotta get that peer reviewed. I know it's true.
Wait, no, I'm peer reviewing for you right now. I am your peer, and it is true. They are great. This wasn't double blind peer review, but, like, I support. Yes.
But, like, this is more of an exploration some of the time than it is, like, making solid claims.
Mhm, mhm. And I think that's kind of one of the reasons that we pick things for the podcast to talk about. Like, yes, there is that, as you were saying, like, will people actually listen to us talk about this? But a lot of times it's like, okay, we think something interesting is happening and we just kind of
Mhm.
want to have a conversation about it and hear someone else's thoughts on it. So, like, I remember when we were watching It's Okay to Not Be Okay,
Mhm.
and we were both like, there's some interesting shit happening in this episode. And I was a little worried about how to have those conversations while we
Oh,
were
yeah. I
watching.
had to, like, pull you to talk about that one, I
Yeah.
think, even though we
Yeah.
just kept having so much to say about it. And
Yeah.
and I think part of that, actually, so thinking about, I don't know, just the things we feel confident talking about in the podcast, is being willing
Yeah.
to have opinions about something, even if it's not our specific area of expertise.
Mm.
Like, we
Mhm.
don't,
Mhm.
not that I should be out here making claims about things that I know nothing about,
Oh,
but,
yes.
like, I know
That's different.
enough about, like, disability studies to at least sort of, like, be aware of sort of the general contours of those conversations. So then
Mm.
when we talk
Mhm.
about something
Mhm.
like It's Okay to Not Be Okay, I can think about that and ask maybe interesting questions, but not necessarily be making claims that, like, I'm the expert, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah. And yeah, and I think, okay, that's another difference. I know this wasn't our conversation has kind of become like weighing the difference between what we do on the podcast and what we do in our own academic work. But I think it's worth kind of poking at a little bit and thinking about quote unquote why literature. Because I think you're absolutely right. I don't feel the same need to be an expert when we talk about things, even as we pull on our expertise. I feel
Mhm.
like we're allowed to be a little bit more affective, i.e., speak a little bit more emotionally about
Mhm.
things without having to kind of be only the bearers of factual, correct information.
Mhm.
And not that facts aren't important. That's not what I'm saying. But more like, we can have feelings about things. Like, for example, if we compare something like the Promising Young Woman episode to our Bridgerton episode, which were two that I liked a lot but did very, very different things, the
Mhm.
Promising Young Woman episode leaned more into like, we're citing people. We have definitions that we're reading to you. We have quotes that we're using, which kind of is a little bit more academic papery versus Bridgerton, where we were like, hey, these are the things we study. This is what we're pulling on. These things feel uncomfortable, but also the Duke and the Boxer Man are very hot, and we also need to talk about that. So I'm gonna kind of wind myself up there, but I do think it's kind of interesting how under the banner of the study of literature, the podcast is giving us this way of exploring another way of talking about these kinds of things that are important to us that might not necessarily make the cut in an academic writing kind of way.
Well, and it's also, I think it allows us, and maybe this we can also talk about why we pick the things we pick for the podcast and how we pick them. But part of that,
Yeah.
like if we think about Bridgerton and Promising Young Woman and Korean dramas and a lot of
Mhm.
the things we're talking about, those are also not comics or children's literature.
Yeah, yeah.
So it allows us to spend time on things that we are watching because they spark joy
Right.
or because they are doing something very, very interesting that's like adjacent to the questions we are
Yeah.
asking,
Mhm. Mhm.
and sort of ask the questions and have the kind of conversations that we enjoy having anyway, like in
Right.
English literature classrooms about texts, using
Yeah.
also text very broadly from
Mhm.
a variety of spaces that we wouldn't necessarily publish about, but that we care
Right.
about.
Right. No, absolutely. And it also gives us the flexibility to kind of watch something and be like, "Oh, there's something cool happening here. Let's talk about it," which you don't necessarily get to do in a classroom or in a prescribed space or place.
Hmm.
A lot of our episodes have happened because Corinne will say, "Hey, I'm going to start watching this." Or I'll be like, "Hey, I've found this weird thing on Netflix that we should talk about." So it definitely gives us some flexibility, you
Hmm.
know. And I think that kind of ties back into our conversation about what literature is, because I think there is that flexibility there, right? I don't know.
Hmm.
Uh, where am I going with this? I think a lot of what we're doing with the podcast and with our conversations about literature and our thoughts about literature is kind of trying to show that a lot of these things are doing interesting stuff, but are also worth talking about, and maybe
Hmm.
bend and expand some people's reactions to or understanding of the media that they are watching, reading, intaking. But also, I guess, kind of speaking back to the academy in some ways, if that makes sense, you
Hmm.
know, and about what it means to be an academic. I don't know. That might be too heady.
Well, and also just more generally, like thinking about accessibility to a public audience and talking to people that are not just like also getting PhDs.
Mhm,
Although, shout
mhm.
out to everyone also getting a PhD. This shit is hard.
It's very
Uh,
difficult, especially in a pandemic, like, what? I'm
but
sorry.
speaking to other people, like thinking about, because I think the ways this is maybe circling back to like what our podcast is about and why we
Mhm.
are talking about not just literature but specifically sex and love in literature is because we are deeply invested in the ways that sex and different kinds of love are depicted in popular culture,
Yep,
because there is this sort of reciprocal relationship between people's lived realities and what we see depicted in texts.
yep.
And like,
Mhm.
I'm not saying that you'll see that weird sex scene on, I don't know, Riverdale and be like, I'm gonna try that now. But I don't even watch Riverdale. I don't know why that's the one
I
I
was
went
gonna
with.
say, okay.
But it does affect like the way we think about it and the way we approach it.
Yes,
And I think that is
yes.
something that I am particularly cognizant of as a children's and young adult literature scholar, because I
Mhm.
think, like, I'm teaching a class on sex in children's and young adult literature right now, and one of the things we're thinking a lot about in the class is like how much of what is happening in these books is just being like picked up out of the book and put into young readers' brains. And I do think
Mm.
that I think is erasing a lot of the like critical reading skills that young readers have, but also like for sensitive topics like sex that young people don't necessarily feel comfortable talking to adults about or asking
Mhm.
questions
Mhm.
about, or like
Mhm.
don't have access to like adequate sex education information that could answer those questions. Like if they're
Mhm.
pulling their knowledge of how sex works from A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, where the male lead growls, like that is a problem.
Well, hold on, wait a minute. The male lead growling is a
There's
problem?
That's not
Because
specifically the problem.
I was gonna
I
say.
don't need to be out here calling out Sarah J. Maas. She writes very interesting stories, and her books sell a lot and keep a lot of other authors afloat. But like, there's just something about her sex scenes, man. They're so weird.
I'm just saying, sometimes a little growling is not a terrible thing, but I'm gonna leave that one alone. We're not gonna go there.
Anyway, that could get into conversations about the human and the post-human and the line
I am
between
a
human and
monster
animal and
I am a
fairy.
monster study scholar. Like I can't look down on the growling, okay? But continue. That wasn't the important part.
The important part is we should think critically about how sex is depicted in literature.
To add one more kind of tongue-in-cheek reason for why I guess literature is especially broad in our podcast is that we're tired. Like
Okay.
so let me be a little bit more specific, but like I do like reading, don't get me wrong. I love to read. It's part of the reason that I am doing a fucking PhD in English literature, but like there's a lot happening in our lives. There are a lot of things that we're expected to read. There's a lot of things we need to read for the work that we're doing. And
Mhm.
sometimes I just want to watch something. Sometimes I just want to play Destiny with my family and not be, pouring through something that's 500 pages. So the fact that we can still apply kind of, I don't want to say apply our critical thinking skills, but like our academic brains are still working most of the time when
Mhm.
we're watching things. So it's nice to be able to pull in the things that maybe are not taking as much energy to
That
get
don't
through.
Things that don't feel like work.
Yeah, things that don't feel like work. So, like, for example, I know, Corinne, for a lot of reasons, sometimes you draw the line and you're like, I'm not going to write anything academic about K dramas. I'm just not going to do it because you don't want to, like, make that activity that's become such a place of happiness and relaxation for you into a place of work,
Mhm.
right?
Well, and I think this is particularly complicated for the two of us because part of the reason we study children's literature and comics is because
Mm
those are things that we love and
hmm.
love
Mm
to
hmm.
read
Mm
and have
hmm.
always
Mm
loved to read. But like going to read particular like young adult fantasy right now is work for me,
hmm.
even
Mm
though that is like my genre of choice most of the time.
hmm. Mm
Whenever
hmm.
I
Mm hmm.
pick it up, it's like, oh, is should this be in my dissertation?
Right. Mm
Should I write
hmm.
an
Mm hmm.
article about this? What article would I write about this? And it just is hard to do when that's what I'm doing for work the rest of the
Mm
time, to want to do that for fun in the same way.
hmm. Mm hmm. Mm hmm. And I think in the same way is a key word here because it doesn't mean that we're not looking at those things for fun. Like, I pick up comics because I'm like, oh, I want to read this. This is fun. This is exciting. But that doesn't mean that then my brain isn't worrying. So
Mhm.
sometimes putting on sex education gets my brain working in a different way.
I wonder if that's why sex education hasn't worked for me in the same way that it
It
has for
might.
you,
It
because
might.
it's so to be clear, we mean Sex Education, the show on Netflix,
Yes.
which is basically about high schoolers in the UK and their sex stuff in it. But like
Mhm.
for me, that's work.
Yeah. Mhm. Mhm.
Looking at how consent is working, look at how teenagers talk about and learn about sex.
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
work.
Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. So I think it's something that's interesting to consider cuz like on the flip side, I am really enjoying Yumi Cells, but like literally we watched that first episode and my brain was like we could write an article about adaptation in Yumi Cells
Mhm.
and it was like I might do that. That might be fun and wonderful for me, but right now I'm just watching it to enjoy it, not watching it to take notes, not watching it to highlight these moments of
interesting adaptation between medium.
Yeah, yeah, or narrative resonance or whatever the fuck you want to say. So, we are obviously going to read books for the podcast. We read Red, White, and Royal Blue and had a conversation about that. There are some other books that we kind of have in the rotation. There are some comics that I'm throwing onto our list to get Corinne to read. But sometimes it's nice to watch a movie and talk about it and
Mm-hmm.
not expect it to turn into an essay, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that's another reason. So there's a lot, honestly, that does go into us picking things to talk about
Mm-hmm.
on SLL. Sometimes it's just like, this was fun. We want to talk about it. Sometimes it's like, we think it's important to have this conversation and bring it to a broader audience. But sometimes we just want to watch a movie.
Yeah, so TLDR. Why don't y'all talk about books? Because we talk about them too much for work.
Yeah, because we're sleepy and we deserve to watch TV too. Damn it. But no, jokes aside. Anything else you want to add? I feel like we kind of went down a lot of twisty paths, but
No, I think, yeah, the biggest takeaway that I would want people to come away with from this podcast is that that we mean a lot of things by literature, and that should be inclusive and an invitation rather than
yes.
something used to exclude people or different kinds of media.
No, I agree. I think an invitation is a great way to put it, right? One of the things we said, I think it was in Why Sex, is that part of the reason we're even doing this podcast is to help kind of expand people's minds about the things that they're reading, especially when sex and love and romance are involved. So yeah, I think it's an invitation to participate in these conversations and that it doesn't have to be capital L literature in order for it to matter. That the conversations we're having about pop culture are almost just as important, if not more important, than the conversations that are being had about, uh, about things in the quote unquote canon. I feel like I've been bagging on Shakespeare a lot. I actually like Shakespeare. I was a pre-1800 scholar like in undergrad. So like I'm not saying that those kinds of things aren't important, but like there are broader conversations to be had. So I think an invitation is kind of, that was a good choice of words. Good job, Corinne.
Thanks. All right, so we've been saying that we're going to talk about various things on future episodes for a long time, but as has previously been established with Schitt's Creek, we are liars, including to ourselves. So coming down the pipeline are our interview with Coyote Shook. That will be up as soon as it's edited.
Yes. Interviews are interesting to edit. This is the first time we've done an interview, so it's kind of an experiment for us. So we'd really like to hear your feedback when that one goes live on how that episode works for you guys.
But after that, we are going to, as Ayani keeps saying, because apparently she likes to make sports metaphors for some reason, we are calling an audible.
Why you called me out like that, fam?
But we're going to do an episode on Hometown Cha-Cha-Cha for fun and for Kim's on those dimples.
Something that we forgot to mention when Corinne was talking about Hometown Cha-Cha-Cha sparking joy for her is that my spouse, Andrew, is also watching it with her and has decided that he wants to be ahead of her.
It's so funny. It's also absurd. I watch so many, like, I'm currently watching like 4 K-dramas, and the only reason, like, he started to date the episode that dropped today before me, and the only reason he managed to do that is because I went to yoga this morning. But he, like, saw that as a great victory for himself.
So what this means is that he will likely be on the Hometown Cha-Cha-Cha episode, especially since it means that we are pushing back the Your Name episode, which he has been clamoring for. So yeah, you get to enjoy his antics live on the radio. Or not live, pre-recorded.
Live on the radio? Where did that come from?
I don't know.
But so if you are the kind of person who likes to, quote unquote, do your homework for this podcast, watch Hometown Cha-Cha-Cha. It is excellent. I love it. And also it's on Netflix.
Yes, it is on Netflix. It is. I got an advertisement the other day that it is exclusively on Netflix. So that is where you will find it. One other thing worth mentioning, I hope I'll get this edited fast enough, but Corinne and I are actually going to be participating in the, what is it, Humanities Podcasting Symposium on
Hmm.
October 16th. So it's a free event. We'll post a link to the registration page in the show notes. But if you would like to hear Corinne and I talk a bit about finding your podcast voice as a host, you can register for the Humanities Podcast Symposium. It looks like there's going to be a lot of other great presentations that are happening, other workshops that are happening. So feel free to check it out. It is completely free, and it is the weekend of October 16th. So that's, I think, the 16th and the 15th, the Friday, and the 16th, the Saturday, if I'm remembering correctly.
Oh,
But
I don't know time.
I know it's all alive, but check in the show notes. The link to the Eventbrite page will have the correct dates. But that should be a lot of fun. It's really interesting. I think this is the first time they're doing this symposium, so I'm looking
Hmm.
forward to getting together with other academic and quote unquote semi-academic podcasters to hear their thoughts on what podcasting in the humanities is like. So, we're making it big, y'all. We doing big things out here.
But if you have opinions about what literature is, or you have a suggestion for what capital L or lowercase l literature you would like us to talk about next, please find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at SexLoveLit, all one word. And if you'd be so kind, if you could subscribe and or leave us a review, that helps other people to find us and also listen to us talk about what literature is.
And as a note, as far as leaving reviews, you can leave reviews on Apple Podcasts, Castbox, perhaps, and Podchaser. Spotify doesn't let you leave reviews, but also it's still nice when you subscribe because we see
Yes.
our little subscriber number go up, and that gives us a hit of dopamine.
Also, it helps people find us. It's not just for the dopamine.
I mean, is it not just for the dopamine?
Okay, it's
No.
just for Ayani's dopamine, no other reasons.
For my fix, for no other reason. But with that, this has been another quote unquote La Petite episode of SLL.
Again,
Thank you.
see, we are liars.
Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.